competitive ultimate frisbee player. That's the related to Sonic Master at different times. I don't know if that's totally
How long was that silent retreat you did?
the longest silent retreat. 7 days. Yeah, actually, I should probably turn on the mic. But not too early.
You're good, Lucas?
Check. Turn off my phone, or else my mom will feel like calling right now. She has a sense. What's the worst time of day to call my son? And every day she finds it.
Yeah. Welcome, everybody. Today it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Norm Farb. Norm got his bachelor's degree at the University of Waterloo and a master's and a PhD from the University of Toronto. And he did a postdoc at the Rotman Research Institute and then got a job at the University of Toronto, Mississauga. He runs the Regulatory and Affective Dynamics Lab and looks at the interaction of your sense of self, how you interocept, and self-regulation. And a couple of interesting facts. So he's actually spent 10 days at a silent retreat. So he said if he talks really fast, it's a rebound effect. And he was an ultimate Frisbee competitor. And did you beat Mac, or?
Yeah, we were really good. We had like an all grad student team, so we had like a lot of continuity from year to year. So those lanky undergrads never stood a chance.
Okay, so I'll just remind everybody that there's a reception afterwards up in room 205, and please give Norm a warm welcome.
Thanks, David. Can you all hear me okay? Thanks for the thumbs up in the back row, cheap seats. So first of all, just thanks so much for having me. It's an honor, a privilege to have people willing to listen to my research, and it's hard to get people to listen, so I really appreciate you being here, and I'll try to make it worth your time. I'm going to be talking today mostly about the kind of clinical applications of my research, and I'm going to try to convince you in the next 45 to 50 minutes or so that there is a real issue around staying open to sensation or being able to take in new information that we don't really appreciate as being a factor in our mental health. So that's the game I'm playing. Let's see if we can get you there. So school work can be a bit stressful. And so I'm quite interested in individual differences between the people who manage to make their way through and those who may succumb to those stressors. I myself moved from a fairly sheltered high school situation right into a really hard computer engineering program, and by the second term of trying to both discover how to drink, for instance, and also differential equations, totally flamed out and dropped out of the program. So I had a formative experience that was where it's hard not to have counterfactual thinking around, what kind of person would have made it, would I have had to be to make it through versus not. And on the flip side, I didn't really mean to tell this anecdote, but here I go. By the time I was in grad school in PhD, probably second year, this guy joined my lab who turned out to, not my lab, the lab I was in, my PI's lab, but joined.
So smart, you got it early.
In that same.
And it's oh, you're just so dedicated. You got
had this mutual admiration for each other. He's like, oh, you're so smart, you got out early. And I was like, oh, you're so, you were so dedicated, you got through it. And he's like, yeah, for what? Now I'm going to start my PhD, I'm 3 years behind you. So I think there's always these kind of trade-offs. And yeah, I think it's just really interesting to look at how one person navigates through a stressful situation versus another. And the name of the game is maybe having more than one choice when you hit those kind of stressors. The fact that we all can feel stress is no accident. Stress is a widely conserved, evolutionarily conserved response. The story that is generally told is that stress is needed to help us evade predators, like a tiger jumps out of the forest or jungle at you. And if your body can really quickly hit a high level of arousal and also pull like blood vessels away from the surface of the skin and get you really focused on the problem of not dying, then you're more likely to pass on your genes to other species. And we know now that it's not just like tigers and stuff, stress response effects, it also affects all sorts of physiological processes, including immune responses. So the ability to mobilize metabolic resources to deal with threats both at the macro and micro level is part of why we all can get so stressed out, because it's been necessary for our survival. And although we have resolved many acute stressors, like the things that are going to kill you in the next 24 hours, most of us do not have a lot of exposure to. And despite what you might read in the media, life's pretty good now compared to any other time almost in human history that you could have been alive in terms of not having acute stressors. It's been done in a sort of trade-off where we've replaced a lot of those acute stressors with chronic stressors, right? The malaise, the ennui, the languishing that accompanies everyday life, where things are more or less safe, but also kind of subtly threatening, right? And it's a weird sort of mix we have now, where there's like kind of enough threat that we still are triggering stress responses, but there's no clear path to resolution, or like purpose stressed. There, you've heard it here first. And so we have all these other disorders spiking up as what could arguably be compensatory reactions to not having to deal with as many acute stressors, but having to find a way to stay functioning in this kind of slow attrition that we feel. And it's not helped very much in the past decade or two, where the primary currency for a lot of like the smartest people in the world that they're trying to get is like getting to hijack our attention, right? So now the ability to make us absorb threats is big business, right? Because one of the most predictable ways of grabbing your attention, like no matter how interesting and handsome I am, if someone runs in with a knife, you're not going to care about me at all, right? Like probably, unless I have a bigger knife. And that's really the arms race we're playing right now with social media. And so, and it's not like just take my word for it. Like there's lots of leaked reports now from like Instagram or Facebook where they know this, and it's actually like, and their response has been like, how do we sharpen these knives even more? Right? How do we get an even bigger knife to keep you off our competitor's platform? And so, of course, you can't, if it was just pure threat, you would avoid it. So it has to have like a secret sauce of like threat and then like puppies. And like, okay, I feel a little better, thank you, platform. And then like threat, oh, I'm really scared, take care of me, platform. And then eventually we're just like attending constantly, right? But we're attending to something that I would argue is probably strongly skewed towards the negative. And if you want to see someone who's not super pessimistic about the state of the world, I would find like your friend who spends the least amount of time on social media. And so we end up having, even if we do try to like be mindful of our consumption of other people's ideas of what we should be attending to, we can often feel like we're just sort of hanging on in a world that's spiraling out of control. And part of that is like because we were manipulated, and part of it is like our world actually is sort of spiraling out of control, so it's rational to feel that way. But again, there's no real way out of that in the short term, right? And so this feeling like you're stuck in a place where you're stressed and you just have to tough it out until the stressors go away because you yourself are powerless to address the causes of your stress is very well documented both in animal literatures and in human literatures, and popularized at least partially by Hans Selye, who's a Hungarian-Canadian endocrinologist who's really popularized this idea of like the stress response. So first something happens, you kind of freeze, like, whoa, something happened, and then your body amps up to deal with it. But if you can't deal with it, and you keep getting stress signals, your body keeps pushing itself into this amped up state, and that's where we get chronic stress, which would place you squarely in this kind of resistance phase, right? And although there's many different ways of trying to like de-stress yourself, what seems very, very clear from the literature is that if you sit in the resistance phase long enough, you will experience some sort of breakdown, whether it's mental, physiological, or both. The stress hormones that, for instance, prepare you to run faster and longer also are toxic if you're exposed to them for long periods of time. The same, so you'll end up having atrophy in the basal structures of the brain and have early onset dementia, for instance. The same physiological response that pulls and contracts your blood vessels away from the surface of your skin so that you won't bleed out if you get scratched or cut, also lead to hardening of arteries over time and lead to heart disease. So we can see that a local adaptive response that is then extended in a very non-selected way, because we weren't selecting for Twitter like 10,000 years ago, is now leading to a whole host of health complications, so the story goes. And so you can think of this, of being resistance, of like the phenomenology of that, of what it feels like, is you feel like you're stuck in some kind of stressful story, like you're a character in this story, but you don't know how to get out of the story. Right? That's sort of like how it feels like. And then there's lots of other language for it, and every couple of weeks the New York Times comes up with another word and an epidemic, and it's all describing the same pattern. Right? Just we can label it different ways. And not just New York Times, like the UK appointed a minister of loneliness, which sounds like a really tough job. But their job is to fix the problem of people feeling lonely. And again, what's loneliness? Like I feel that I'm not getting adequate levels of social support. I'm surviving, but I'm not living the life I would want to. I feel like cut off from other people. So it's just it's another way of describing what I think is, another facet of the same problem. And so I'm really interested in kind of exploring this idea of why we feel so stuck. I already gave you a solution that I would predict would reduce your stress level like by double-digit percentages, which would be like just take a break from social media. You would feel better, I promise you. But like, why would you? It's right there. And also puppies. So like it's hard, right? So there's a mystery here. It's not trivial for us to do the things we know we would need to do to feel better. And part of that is because there must be something that's not obvious or not about like why we're getting stuck. And I think, merging together a bit of a neuroscience lens into this can help us understand what our brains are trying to do and then how that might have kind of gone awry. So let's talk about that. I showed this slide to Professor Shore's class that I just did a guest lecture to this morning. And this idea there is that like most of our waking life is really about reenacting habitual patterns that we know are kind of good enough to survive or get by on, right? You have this kind of status quo life on autopilot, and it actually takes something often surprising, if not downright upsetting, to shake us out of our habitual way of doing things, right? Like if you're used to taking the bus every morning to campus, the chances of you just deciding randomly not to take the bus, given that's how you get to campus, is pretty low. But if all of a sudden, like the bus driver, I don't know, swore at you one morning, and then you're like, I don't know, let me reconsider my bus choices. So I think the real magic moment, just to literally duplicate what I said in the other lecture, is this kind of moment when we realize, oh, and this comic does have more panels that are never shown in the meme, is this magic moment when we are able to realize that like the status quo, life doing what we're most used to, actually isn't fine, right? Like something has to upset us, and for sometimes it's like failing an exam and dropping out of a computer engineering program. Sometimes it's like a major loss in your life, a failure, a breakup, and sometimes you just are exposed to some riveting piece of art that makes you see things in a different perspective. But something happens that kind of shakes you out of the idea that what's happening is normal. And if I was really brave, I would just like play the David Foster Wallace valedictory address, "This is Water," where like we aren't really aware that how much we take for granted the context we operate in. So if I talk, you're like, isn't there something better than what I just watched? Like Google "This is Water," the commencement speech by David Foster Wallace. He'll talk all about getting saturated by a context to the point where it's invisible to us. But the amazing, hopeful thing about human beings is we can become aware of our contexts, and all it takes is a slightly different perspective to interfere with the monolithic dominance of the context we're in. And really, I would argue, for us to have a healthy life, we need to be able to balance our ability to lean into the knowledge we already have and exploit that knowledge, right? Imagine treating every moment you get into sit in a car as like the first time you've ever sat in a car is not the best way to drive, right? And in fact, it would be impossible. And at the same time, like driving as though there's no obstacles on days when there are obstacles is also not great, right? So we need to be able to balance taking in new information that forces us to update, expand, or change our models of the world with also being able to rely on our hard-earned knowledge, right? And this idea that we're always trying to balance between what's expected and what's actually coming in from the world is the foundation, I would say, of most of like the modern predictive coding theory of the brain, right? Which suggests that at every level of neural representation, the brain is trying to make good predictions about the signals that are coming in. And we only prioritize deeper processing of signals when they violate those expectations. So this could be, I didn't think that there should be like a table here, and now wait, there's an edge here where there shouldn't be, so my visual system like orients, like sends up a signal like maybe you should look before you continue to walk. Or it could be like, I thought my job would be more rewarding and I'm realizing now it feels empty and meaningless, right? So you can have surprises like all the way across from the lowest levels of sensory representation to the highest orders of meaning making and goal setting. And I think that's part of the allure of the predictive coding model. So the currency by which the brain operates is in trying to keep things not chaotic to minimize surprises, right? And the way we do that is by having enough knowledge to make good predictions about what's happening now. And when those predictions are bad, we feel surprise, which can also be known as prediction error if you want to be more technical about it. And then when surprise happens, we have motivation to not be surprised anymore. Right? Very few people like have something jump out at them and go like, ah, and then just like walk away. You're like, what happened? I need to see what jumped out at me. I need to stop it from happening again, and so on and so forth, right? So there's this idea that we need to minimize our prediction error. And I think a lot of emerging clinical psychology theories are based on how this desire, or it's more than a desire, it's like a need, a drive to minimize surprise goes wrong. So on one side we have like what we already know about the worlds, right? And we know a lot from a neuroscience perspective about kind of how this happens. Most of how we know the world is through like the stories we tell ourselves about the world, at least at like a conscious explicit level. And we know that habits, whether they're habits around like just how to like regulate breathing and heartbeat and other physiological signals, all the way up to how we're going to interpret and relate to ourselves and other people in the world, might all be that job might be taken on by this default mode network in the brain, right? We know that because when you ask people to just take a break in the scanner from doing like mental arithmetic or rotation or memory tasks, this part of the brain lights up. It's very hard to light up this set of cortical midline networks, the medial prefrontal cortex and the posterior cingulate, and the two little side hubs in the supramarginal gyrus or temporal parietal junction. Anyway, there's a set of brain regions that light up when you tell people to take a break in the scanner, and really almost the only task that you can get people to do actively that will activate these networks is to like think self-referential thoughts. So like tell me whether this word describes you or not. But if you do anything else that's like active and new and forces you to take in and integrate new information, this network turns right off, right, in order to prioritize resources for you doing actual problem solving and interacting with sensory input and motor output. So this is like when things are going business as usual, and one of the things we do, like if somehow for a moment your mind wanders during this riveting talk, you probably aren't going to think randomly about like, what is blue? But more likely think like, you know, why am I here? What am I having for dinner? Why am I in this program at all? Like, there are going to be a lot of like me questions, right? So like some of the most typical things we do are these kind of like self-interested like reflections. And you could say that's sort of like one of the most high order habits that we have is making sense of our place in the world, right? And if you lose the ability to do that, it's profoundly dysfunctional, right? Like depersonalization, derealization disorders, and that whole family of disorders. So really important to have this knowledge, and it's probably going to help represent like what we already know and expect in the world. And you'll notice there's a third like bump there. We were not actually just like expecting things to go exactly how they went in the past. We actually modify it slightly to take into context, you know, what's happening around us and things like that. But it's like an extension. The simulation of what we expect is an extension of that prior knowledge that's probably represented in the default mode network. And we can see why this has clinical relevance because in acute depressive episodes, for instance, the default network is like on steroids. So it's now spread beyond its normal boundaries to actually take up some of the real estate that would be done for like effort for problem solving and reflection, right? And it's led to this dorsal nexus hypothesis of depression where like networks that should normally play off of each other, like am I actually trying to do something and take information or lean back on habit, what you're trying to do actively is continue to unpack this self-reflection because you're so used to doing it. And so you're actually just feeding more into this sort of navel gazing. And especially if the content of that reflection is really negative, as it is in depression, you're going to have a bad time. So we can see having too much reliance on existing knowledge, especially when that knowledge is dysphoric, right? It leads us to have a sense of hopelessness or worthlessness or so on or so forth, could be a kind of prison, right? And even thinking things are always great, right, is a kind of prison, right? That you describe that as mania. Like everything I do is wonderful. Like that's also dysfunctional. So having a very rigid architecture for your expectations of yourself and how you relate to the world isn't great, even though we definitely need that knowledge base to make sense of ourselves in the world. So you could think of depression in one way as priors that are just resistant to change, right? You have these expectations for how things are supposed to go, and even if other interfering information comes in, like, well, generally I feel horrible and worthless, but actually say it's okay. If you're resistant to updating your model to saying like, okay, only most of the time do I feel hopeless and worthless, then you have a recipe for staying depressed, right? And the reality is like very, very few people feel any given way all of the time. It just seems that way sometimes, right? And that also feeds into this like, well, it does have to do with why we get stuck. So the antidote, or not antidote, I should say, but the way that you do update models is you take in new information. People are like, how does that happen? If only we had some way to take in new information. And I'm like, brah, half your brain is designed to take in new information. And we call that sensing. And so what is sensation? It is letting outside information, including outside the brain at least, information, come in and potentially change your models. That's what sensation is, right? Like, sensation, you don't control that information. If you did, you wouldn't call it sensation. You'd call it like thinking or rehearsal or recalling. So you're taking in information you don't have a lot of control about, and you're letting it be represented as information in your brain, which means you're changing your brain. So the way that we actually update models is we let other information in. Right? This is one way to look at it. I'm sure there's other ways and exceptions and boundary conditions, but this is the game I'm playing right now in this talk. Okay? And so you can see how in depression, if what we form is we start to accumulate more and more knowledge of negative events, and those negative events become associated with each other and quickly triggered by even minor negative events. And this is true in people with recurrent depression. Your first episode or two probably follows something really like things people would say is objectively bad happening. But by the time you have a fifth or sixth episode, it might be a kind of minor upset that can still create that spiral into depression. So there's so much packaging of like the habit of interpreting and understanding the world in this really negative way, that's quite easy for it to be reactivated in the future. And it's harder and harder for this kind of monolithic block of meanings to then be interfered with by any one specific experience, right? So you start to see this over-reliance on prior knowledge to the detriment of the person in terms of their ability to function as normal in daily society. And by contrast, leaning right into sensation and spending time in pure, uninterpreted sensation even is not that, right? It's taking in information in ways where, well, what's going to be the consequence of that? You don't know. If you knew, you'd be banking on existing information. So I want to kind of get this tension laid out. Maybe I've spent enough time on it already. My first claim to fame sort of paper was on early mindfulness training in sort of the Worried Well, people signing up for a mindfulness-based stress reduction course, and comparing people who signed up for the course who are on wait list versus those who just completed the course. And we asked them to switch between a mode of thinking about themselves in terms of like, am I honest? Am I a good person? Am I sneaky? Like you give them different words and ask them to analyze and evaluate and justify and be conceptual and bank on their knowledge. We call that a sort of evaluative mode. And we'd ask people then to shift into a mode where they are open and sensory. And we found that if you did everyone could kind of turn down the default network a little bit when you ask them to not be as evaluative. But it took a bit of practice to sit in a place where you're really sensory and receptive enough that you start actually seeing activation of parts of the body map on the somatosensory cortex and the insula, which is ostensibly representing sensory signals from inside the body. And there's lots of scholarship on that. I talked about this morning in the guest lecture on, and then there are pathways to the insula for representing the body's internal state and some other attentional control regions in the front of the brain turning on. And so people can, with their attention and the right support, and it might take practice to start doing it like fluidly, shift between modes of trying to exploit existing knowledge and use that to justify and explain experience, or be open and receptive to information as it comes in. And even prior to the data I'm going to show you from my lab, there's other sort of converging lines of evidence that point to people becoming quite stressed and then getting worse at updating their existing knowledge. You might see blunted response to reward paradigms that feed into like why you see anhedonian depression. And you can see in neural studies that you get more of this kind of default mode network activation, while the executive system, like doing new things and problem solving, tends to get suppressed. So I want to talk about a few lines of, sort of an extended line of research that's been going on for the past 2 decades since I was a wee grad student, and that sort of point to the idea that lower arousal negative emotions like the feeling of sadness, languishing, hopelessness, all those juicy, depressing kind of feelings might actually be explainable in terms of an over-reliance on existing knowledge over sensory knowledge. So I'm going to talk about 3 studies, and they all kind of have this general setup of trying to make people sad in the scanner, where we show them a series of sad movie clips and compare it to them watching like home and garden television, which is generally not particularly evocative. We did have one participant who had fought with a producer on home and garden television, so whatever. And also, if you want to get really sad, you should watch late 70s, early 80s dramas. They are just like the Criterion collection, like the culmination of our ability to do slow, sad things before our attention span got too short to sell things that were slow. And so in the very first day I want to talk about, I was still extending this sort of mindfulness research, and we would compare people who had completed mindfulness training against those who had signed up but were waitlisted, show them these sad versus neutral film clips in the scanner. And the kind of question we wanted to ask was, is there something that differentiates like how someone represents sadness that dictates their broader mental health, right? The goal is not really to show that people who did mindfulness training or healthier just never got sad, but maybe that underneath those reports of sadness was a different way of handling the information. So it kind of messed up my color palette. Sorry, those of you who are offended by like how blah this is, but this is just kind of like the details of the design, because we're going to talk about the design over and over again, where we kind of show people like a fixation cross and then a film clip for 45, 50 seconds. Then they would get some prompts and to do like a reflection period, like just like you can just sit and just do whatever, think about what you just saw, and then they would rate how sad they felt. And we would always do trains of 4 films, clips from the same film, so there was a narrative, because I think there has to be something, you have to kind of like learn about the character and then see them losing something and then see them getting upset to have that full-blown sadness feeling. So they're seeing maybe, I don't know, a few minutes of film altogether. And we can do these kind of on-off blocks, which is important for the scanner. And then those whole blocks of like a sad film clips or neutral film clips can be interleaved. So initially we just did neutral sad because we were worried about washout, but eventually we did like crossover things where sometimes they would do a run of neutral sad and then another of sad neutral and so on and so forth. So that would be the kind of general experimental paradigm I'm going to talk about across the next couple of studies. So any questions just about that now? Is it kind of clear? Okay, cool. So in the first study we just had, as I mentioned, these people signed up for mindfulness training. Either they've done it or they were waitlisted. We put them in the scanner. We show them sad film clips. You get their sadness ratings. One of the things we found that we expected to see was that this default mode network activation goes up quite a bit for sad films compared to neutral films. You can also do it parametrically with their sadness ratings on like a 5 or 7 point scale and get the same kind of pattern. So it's not just us saying it's sad versus neutral. And we kind of expected to see that. And we thought that the more the default mode network was activating, the more people were like resting on habitual knowledge and relating it to their own experience, the more depressed they would be. But we actually didn't see any relationship with broader symptom scores with how much the default mode network was activated. But it did seem like really clear that what was happening even without special instruction, and I'll come back to the other half of the story in just a sec, was a lot of this like habit network going online, and this is while they're watching the films. You can also get it while they're reflecting on the films, right? And it's happening automatically. We can kind of see how like maybe this process of self-reference is being at least increased, right? Or leading into habit is being increased in the form of in the face of an emotional stressor. And maybe because this is the network that's turning on automatically when we're not up to anything, this is part of why people just feel stuck. It's sort of just running the conversation. But the other thing we found that took me a while of like watching data and trying to understand it to even like notice it was happening was a lot of deactivations in the brain. And the deactivations of the brain were in sensory regions. And the somatosensory map, so the map of what's happening on the surface of your body in the posterior insula, it's not pictured so much here, but even a little bit in the visual cortex when you're watching these films. So people are, as they get sadder and more distressed, you see that they're actually turning down sensory activation in the brain. And this is not expected because when most of us think of what it feels like to be really sad, we see in our heads like the snot-nosed 6-year-old just bawling about something, and it's like so much feeling that it's pouring out their face. But an adult who's sad often doesn't look that way. Like if they're really having a breakdown, yeah, like they might be ugly crying. But most of us when we're sad are like, and like it's this withdrawal, right? And you hear depression talked about a lot of times as this kind of numbness, like a weight, as opposed to the presence of really strong, booming feelings. And so we start to actually see a way of thinking about sadness as a tendency to not take in new information and a way of sort of avoiding the bad feeling, and then a lot of habit machinery, self-reference machinery spinning up. And when we look at what correlates with people's broader depression inventory scores, and I should say whether people in mindfulness who've done it or who are waitlisted didn't show differences in their sadness ratings. But when we looked at how the deactivation, especially in that insular region, representing the feeling tone inside the body, was deactivating. The more it deactivated, right, the more depressed people were. Even though in the moment they weren't saying like that they were a 7 out of 7 and other people are saying they were a 4 out of 7 for sadness. They're like, yeah, I'm a 4 or 5 out of 7, right? But the deeper consequence of how they represented that information in terms of more tying into existing knowledge and shutting out sensory processing, it was a sensory processing inhibition or deactivation that's actually predicting that they're suffering more broadly, that they're showing depression symptoms, not how much the default mode network was activating. We then tried to leverage this to get money for a CIHR grant and ran like a pilot study that I just sort of threw in last night for fun, where we looked at people with recurrent depression and scanned them in the same paradigm and compared them to healthy controls, and then looked at 18-month follow-up to see if they relapsed or not. And if you're trying to look at like depressive episodes, working with people who have a history of depression means you're already working with a group of people who are at much higher risk of having another episode, right? So after one episode of depression, you're like at least sort of in that 35% range of having another episode, and then it accumulates. So after your second episode, it goes up another 15 or 18%. So by the time you've had like 3 episodes of depression, from a research perspective, it's not bad because it's pretty high chance in the next couple of years you're going to become depressed again. So you might actually catch some people falling into episode. And even in a pilot study like this, if we could catch like a third or half the people being depressed again, we could go back to the scans and say, what was it in the moment when they were remitted? Like at the start of the study, they've recovered from their depressive episode. They're no longer clinically depressed. What is it about how they handle this negative emotion, this mood provocation, that predicts who becomes depressed and who stays healthy? So it's a prospective study, but we were not making any predictions just at the time of scanning. We're waiting till the end of the time and then trying to figure out the association. And reviewers will tell you you can only use the word prediction if you don't have access to the data you're predicting. So I'm definitely never do that and never have. But we were looking at the association with future relapse with something that happened up to like a year and a half before. And in this paper, even though it was quite a small sample, we were able to see that the more people activated the medial prefrontal cortex and association areas, that dorsal nexus, the more likely it was that they were a relapser rather than someone who maintained their remission, who stayed relatively well. They might not be the happiest person in the world. And actually, the remitters had found a way not to deactivate even more than controls. And this was associated with their depression inventory scores and also with their like rumination tendency. So that kind of supports the reverse inferences that I've been sneaking in this entire time. And you can see actually that even if you account for their self-reported rumination, their tendency to activate the prefrontal cortex still has explanatory power for their future depression. So that's a bit different than what I said in the first study. It shows that self-referencing, that default mode network hub lighting up might actually be a risk marker. But the other thing we saw, and this is without any mindfulness training in this study, I should say, was the amount that they deactivated their visual cortex in response to the sad film clips also predicted depression. The opposite, and the more they deactivated their visual cortex, the more likely it was that they became depressed in the past. And the ability to watch sad film clips without deactivating was associated with more self-reported acceptance of challenging or negative emotions. right? So the experiential avoidance, like I don't like this and I shouldn't be feeling this, and I need to get away from this feeling. So I'm going to find some way, whether it's probably not super consciously, but in some intuitive way of blocking out sensation was again shown, this time through the visual cortex, as being a risk marker for depression. And again, just getting self-reported acceptance doesn't tell the whole story. You get a bit more information from the brain activation than you would from that. And all this is in like really small sample, but enough of a sample that you could spend 3, 4, 5 years. In fact, you could spend all of grad school helping your supervisor write a CIHR grant that gets awarded right when you get your PhD. And it turns out that's what I did. And then so while I was postdocing around, we actually ran a much larger trial. So loss of sensory processing can leave a person in the dark. I wanted to make a pun, but I've ruined it by messing up the timing. All right. But you might say, oh, this is a very small sample, and if you like memes, you might become a bit of a skeptical cat, saying like, is this really going to generalize? Is this really a thing? Or have you just run two small end studies and you're trying to stick them together desperately so you can get a job? And that would be a fair accusation when I was like in 2010. But now I'm happy to say we did run a huge trial of prospective relapse vulnerability prediction. We got money to run, in the end, I think 165 people with a history of depression through either mindfulness-based cognitive therapy or a wellness-oriented cognitive therapy, which is like cognitive therapy, but you also do savoring practices to take in the sensation of positive events. And initially, ostensibly, we were going to look at mechanistic differences between a mindfulness approach and a cognitive therapy approach. So we would scan people before and after the therapy and then follow them for 2 years. We scanned about half of the cohort. They don't seem super different than the people we didn't scan. And we end up with 85 people who were scanned both before and after their therapy, and then successfully followed for a full 2 years. They leave the study if they choose to leave the study or if they relapse into depression. Okay? So from that, again, we did a bunch of other tasks in the scanner as well, because like why not if you have the hour? But I want to focus on that same film task. Okay, so making them sat in the scanner. Okay, everyone okay with the design so far? Yeah? All right, and then this is Zindel Siegel, who is running the mood clinic at CAMH at the time, and now has helped found the clinical program at the Scarborough campus of U of T, and has been my stalwart collaborator and external emotion regulator for many years at this point. So shout out to Zindel. Okay. So one thing I would just point out is the therapies themselves seem like they were protective. The cohort was not a super well group of people, even though they were remitted at the time of joining the study. They had between 1 and 10 past episodes, but the modal number was 4. So the most of them had like quite a few full-blown clinical episodes of depression in the past. So we would expect at least a 50% relapse rate over a 2-year follow-up period. And both groups actually seemed equivalently protected. The other thing I'll mention right now off the bat is we tried really hard to find differences between wellness-based cognitive therapy and mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. And, there are a little bit glimmers of differences, but by and large, I'm not going to talk about a difference between these two treatments. And my job here is not to champion mindfulness training, and I want to talk more about the more general effects we saw across the whole sample. So if you're waiting for that, you could just leave now. But I do think we learned a lot about what distinguishes vulnerability from prophylaxis, which is a word I learned in grad school, doesn't just talk about condoms, but really protection from anything unwanted event from happening. And also, I guess I should shout out, this is a survival plot. If you haven't seen them before, everyone starts off healthy at the start of the study, and then whenever one of these lines go down, 1 or more people have left the study. If there's a tick mark, which this graph doesn't have, they leave the study just because they don't want to be in the study anymore, but any other time the line goes down, it's because they confirmed as relapsing into depression. Right, so by the end, you can interpret this as saying like, well, 30 to 40% of your sample relapsed. Okay, quick survival plot primer. All right, so I want to talk about the brain effects, and this is looking across both the pre and post treatment sessions. And in fact, you can get this effect at both pre and post, and you can do a conjunction separately and show that this is robust. So we would call these almost like static markers, like things that don't change a lot over 8 weeks of therapy that predict depression. So before I get into associating with future relapse, There's a few effects I already want to point out. First of all, the mood induction effect was the same effect. Now it's an N of 85 times 2 scanning sessions, so N of 170, where you get a lot of deactivation in the posterior parts of the brain. You get a lot of activation in the default mode network as well as in the striatum. So you get this trade-off showing up across the board. Okay, that's the top panel there. The second panel is looking at the number of depressed episodes as a covariate of this pattern. And the more history the person has of falling into a depressed episode, the more you see deactivation in the posterior insula and the somatosensory cortices. So that's in the same model. It's above and beyond the overall tendency to turn around sensation. Is people with the scars, or you could also think of it as learning of past depressive episodes, are more facile. It's easier for them to block out sensation when they become sad. Okay? Or they do it more. I don't know if it feels easier for them. And if you look at leftover residual symptoms, because even though these people are out of episode, that doesn't mean that they have no symptoms, and most people with a history of recurrent depression are not going to be the shiniest, happiest people on the block, even when they're not in episode. The level of residual symptoms at the time of scanning additionally predicts more shutdown in the somatosensory cortex and posterior insula in these body sensation regions. So their history and current level of symptom burden predicts even greater patterns of sensory shutdown. It does not predict greater default mode level activation. Okay? When we then try to look at future relapse risk relative to the time of scanning, we see that areas in the somatosensory cortex, insula, and also in the motor cortex deactivating predict who's going to relapse in the future and who's going to stay relatively well. We can see from the bar plot in the middle here that everyone is deactivating these regions, right? It's normal to shy away from feeling bad. But the people who end up relapsing, this is just a split half, no, this is relapse versus non-relapse. And I should say, well, about a quarter to a third, like 20, depending on your relapse criteria, because people argue about that, big surprise among academics, somewhere between 17 and like 21, 22 of the 85 participants relapsed. So they're not equal sample sizes, you can't control that. And the people who relapse deactivate a lot more than the people who don't relapse. Okay? And when you look at the survival plot, this is now a median split. So you just take the 85 and split roughly in half, 42 and a half, 42, 43 people in each line, feeding each line. The people who suppress or deactivate their sensory cortices less than the other half of the sample, as a group, relapse at around a 10% rate, and the ones who deactivate in the top 50% relapse at close to a 40% rate. So a massive swing in risk just from this one biomarker or set of biomarkers. These plots are from the right somatosensory cortex, which is where it was the peak activation, but you see a similar, though maybe not quite as impressive plot if you pick these other regions. And you also get, again, visual cortex deactivation as part of this too, as a risk marker. Okay, so it's not just body, it's sensation a bit more generally. This type of effect, if you do test theory, like signal detection theory, is pretty good for detecting if someone's going to relapse again in the future. If they don't show this pattern, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to stay well. So it's more specific of ruling out like future, than it is necessarily sensitive. But maybe I'm getting a little in the weeds with test theory there. We can talk about that more afterwards. What we can see in terms of the broader interpretation is you can start to appreciate this problem of getting stuck a bit more, right? So you feel bad, you turn away from the bad sensation by turning down the ability to represent that sensation, and then what you're left with is just your accumulated knowledge. And if your accumulated knowledge so far is that something really bad is happening and it's probably going to happen again, or you can't get out of this situation, and you're not letting yourself take in new information, you have a recipe for this kind of downward spiral that we see in depression. And the flip side is, and part of why mindfulness is first great strides in breaking into the clinical literature, it may have been around reducing depressive relapse vulnerability, is that if you could find practices that helped you rebuild the ability to engage in sensation in a non-trivial way, right? Sensation without having to fall immediately back into knowledge, but sensation that can actually update knowledge, then you might have a way of kind of reversing this pattern, right? And if you go to really classic meditation instructions, the first instructions, I mean, they're steeped within a cultural tradition where you know why you're practicing, so it's a bit disingenuous to say there's nothing else happening. But the initial instructions are really just about sense absorption. It's just like, just notice when you're breathing, if you're breathing longer than your last breath or shorter. What does it mean? Don't worry about that. Just you're engaged with the sensory type of evaluation to the extent you're evaluating at all. Right? A sensory discernment. You're not trying to figure out whether you're a good person or whether you're going to become enlightened or whatever it is. You're just supposed to focus on sensation. And we see that there's a huge interest in mindfulness. Partially it boom is coming not just from pure hype, but by a growing clinical evidence base that it's actually good for you. I'm going to speed up a bit because I think I talked too slow for the first half an hour, 40 minutes. And there's a lot of hype around mindfulness. And so maybe we can try to understand like that this idea that re-engaging with sensation is one of the characteristics you should look for if someone is telling you that they're selling you like an efficacious mindfulness product, regardless of whether it's a scented oil or a 10-day silent retreat. So one thing we saw, for instance, in that very first study was that the people who suppress the least are those who did mindfulness training. The blue dots compared to the red dots, and they feel better, even though the subjective sadness ratings were the same. You can see a significant difference, especially in that insula deactivation. In the much bigger depression relapse study, we don't actually see that the therapy is helping people to bring back up somatosensory or insula or sensory cortical activity. It's like that is too deep because the first sample here is a group of stressed out community dwelling adults. This is people with a much deeper clinical history. But where we do see a training effect is in the lateral prefrontal cortex, where it tends to activate when people become sad. And to the extent that over the course of therapy it starts activating less, that is also protective. And this is actually a good way, if you don't see this deactivation, it seems somewhat sensitive to the idea that like your treatment didn't really work. But I just want to gloss over this because I'm running out of time. But if you do a connectivity analysis on these deactivation regions, you can see that they are inversely coupled or inversely correlated with activation in a lot of these attentional control regions in the front of the brain. So what people are using the front of their brain to do, or what correlates at least with activation of the front of the brain, is suppression of these sensory regions. So to learn to turn down a prefrontal reaction might actually at least create a space where you could have, at the very least, like you're taking your foot off the brakes, right? And then whether slowly over time, like you would see in studies of the striatum in people who are like chronic meth users, whether you start seeing like reactivation of sensory cortices and recovery over time is a question I can't really answer right now, but is a kind of tantalizing, even longer term goal. The study already took like 2 years of just actually running the study, so it's hard to run this really long research. So it seems like going into a sense, learning how to get rid of these inhibitory habits might actually be really, really important for dealing with sadness and loss in this kind of depressive arc, because it at least allows you to get out of, to stop blocking out the possibility for change. But if all you're doing is getting rid of your compensatory or emotion regulation habits, that isn't necessarily a great place to hang out. Just have pulled all the weeds out, but you didn't plant anything. And so the other part of sensation is it's not just about getting relief from this oppressive weight of nothing ever changing and being stuck in this languishing state. Sensation is also, there's actually content to the information you're taking in. And I don't have quite enough time to really dive into that as much, but and a lot of mindfulness training research has focused on this kind of relief you get of having a relaxation response, of feeling like it's safe at least maybe to sense things, and not so much on what comes after in terms of then identifying places of value and meaning in life, which we know from a common sense and other clinical perspectives is really, really important. So what we did in this study, and now I've really almost out of time, so I apologize for that, but I'm going to kind of try to wrap up now, is try to take a whole bunch of self-reported questionnaires and see what factors we could form out of them, and see which of those factors mattered for also predicting relapse or sustained health. And essentially we found 3 factors across a whole bunch of mindfulness and mental health and mood questionnaires, symptom questionnaires. We saw one factor that was the ability to watch your thoughts without completely treating them as facts, which is known as decentering or cognitive diffusion or perspective taking or metacognitive awareness. Lots of silos with different names in academia talking about roughly the same thing. We also saw a factor that was more about not always having to judge and make meanings around experience, which is also associated with acceptance of experience, which we call distress tolerance, like bad things can happen without you having to do something about it. And then the final factor was all the symptom burden scores. And out of those 3 measures, so these are the actual measures, but I'll show them afterwards if you want to see them again. I just want to make a quick note that decentering is not pure, bare, non-judgmental attention. The decentering factor has all these attention items mixed in with positive affect attitude items. So it's actually like a warm, curious, friendly kind of attention. It's not bare attention that we see in our decentering factor. And adding another factor did not separate these items from each other. They're fused in this clinical sample. So what we see is that over the course of the intervention, which is up to the dotted vertical line, you get a big spike in everything, including symptoms, because it's really stressful doing group therapy. It's not always fun, and other people in the group, they're weird. Yeah, and your facilitator, also weird. So then you see like a kind of up and down, sort of unpredictable movement of residual symptoms, but you see continued growth in the kind of 2 compensatory skills, decentering and distress tolerance. And if you look at the intercepts, like where people start, and the slopes of how they change over time, it's the growth and decentering out of these measures, that the slope of decentering change, that predicts whether people relapse or not. Distress tolerance is just on the wrong side of significance, so that means it wasn't significant, and we won't start talking about trends. And residual symptoms, the baseline level of symptoms is predictive of future relapse, but you can't really do much about that. Like that's the symptoms like after you responded to, or had your treatment already, and the change in symptoms actually isn't predictive. So the thing you might be able to control is like these acquired skills. And I'm really running out of time. So I just want to say, like, how do you acquire these skills? And if you have to go to class, thanks for being with me so far. So the amount people practice either cognitive therapy skills or mindfulness-based cognitive therapy skills does not predict whether they relapse or not. It does predict how much they're going to practice after the 8 weeks are over. And then if you practice after the 8 weeks are over, so you've internalized this training, also does not predict relapse or not. But it does predict how likely you are to show a positive slope and increase in your decentering skills. And if you see that increase, that's where you see protection against relapse. So what can you learn in a course is how to practice. What is that going to predict? Are you going to be able to continue to practice? If you continue to practice, it might only be useful if it actually helps you feel like you're growing these perspective taking and distress tolerance skills. And if you can actually grow these skills, that seems to be protective. So what's happening there is the ability to step back and actually witness and be curious about and potentially absorb your experience. So it's not couched exactly as sensation, because we didn't really have that hypothesis at the time. We've since been trying to develop behavioral measures of what parts of things like a breath monitoring exercise matters for mental health. And I will just say, as a quick spoiler, accuracy on detecting small changes in your breathing rate, which we can push around, and I'll talk about that in the Q&A if you want, don't really matter. So I'm just going to jump right over this. What matters the most actually is just how confident people feel while they pay attention, like how much they feel okay about paying attention to their body sensation. But accuracy, and even what's called in the UK like metaperceptual awareness, where you're only confident at the times you're accurate, neither of those things are actually related to mental health. It's about having confidence about getting in there with sensation, regardless of whether you're in the 10th percentile, the 90th percentile of the sample. And yes, I'm sure there's boundary conditions where not sensing anything or sensing everything too much is bad for you, but most of people in the range, of the normal range, like literally the normal range, it has no relationship with mental health. It's confidence that matters. So I just want to sum up, and then I can always jump back to other slides if there's questions that provoke them. We can look at wellness as this kind of ongoing process of developing skills, and one of those skills is the ability to resist the effect of stress at robbing us of sensation. And so self-care techniques shouldn't be about not feeling bad, because that's the idea that gets people stuck in the first place. It's not about like you don't want to feel bad, but instead focus on what can you do to be able to be with ambiguous, surprising sensations, some of which will be bad and aversive. And if you can feel that you're able to turn more towards those sensations, especially in the face of stress, now maybe you're getting somewhere mechanistically, right? So, and perhaps at some point you also noticing patterns in how you react that can turn to actual insight and new meanings and personal growth and development. And decentering is not just total non-judgmental bare attention. The kind of healthy decentering that we're talking about also has these kind of kind, optimistic attitudes about and confidence about that attentional process. And developing this construct of interoceptive confidence, I think, is something I'm really interested in. And my final point before I finish 5 minutes late is that it doesn't have to necessarily be mindfulness that gets you on this path, right? Anything where you can really be absorbed in sensory input in a place where you would normally spend a life of distraction or conceptual evaluation or falling into habit is probably going to have these benefits. And I think that's why we see a lot of emerging evidence from fields, including mindfulness, but also exercise, time in nature, horticultural therapy, art exposure, experience of awe, psychotherapy, and now psychedelics, because these all have this ability of helping us connect more with the unexpected, surprising information that our brains are trying to minimize all the time, with the prospect of after that initial upset, we might actually experience change out of a knowledge system that's leaving us languishing. So hopefully we can then kind of balance the need to take things in and have all the feelings with the ability to still have knowledge and be able to sort of titrate and toggle between those modes. And if we do that, we may actually get you on this path towards upward spirals. So I apologize again for going over time, but thank you so much for your attention. And if we have time, I'm happy to chat and answer questions and hear your ideas. So thank you so much.
I know some people have to run to class, but anybody can stay. We'll welcome any questions, and Norm, I'll let you just field your own questions.
Sure, yeah. Hi.
We get a deactivation in sensory region.
Yeah.
What that means, and also what's the implication to behavior? If they really getting sensory input, do they ignore it or?
I think it's the way to think about it. Yeah, I think it's like when you're thinking really hard about something, or you're listening really hard about something, and someone else says something. Like at one level, you know they're saying something, but then they're like, you're not really engaging with it, right? So I don't think like they're getting to the point where like they go blind, right, or something like that, or like I'm deaf. Oh no, I got so depressed I lost hearing. But the salience of sensory cues gets really, really turned down. And if we talk more like in anatomical terms, these sensory afferents to the brain are not activating the salience network that would disrupt, a habitual train of thought. And so you end up spending way more time in a kind of mental habit. So it's not that like, and there may still be an ability, and we poked a little bit at this, to see that people's like visual field or auditory processing or something like that is becoming impaired. But it's hard to measure that because already when you start feeling sad, like all reaction times just take longer. So it's not like they go blind, but like there's like this disconnect, and then they can sort of move back. You get less efficient at being able to take in what's happening. So I don't think it's as stark as you lose access to the sensation, but you're definitely not like being disrupted from business as usual by the sensation. And if you're not doing that, you're probably not learning or changing habits, because you have to not do the thing you normally do to have a chance of extinguishing what you're most used to doing, not just doing, but also perceiving and believing. Yeah, if that helps. Yeah. Yeah.
So you linked, back in the beginning, you linked your research to endocrinology and sort of endocrine indicators. And I was wondering regarding sort of these positive confirmation biases that you're getting from sense foraging, do we have like sort of like endocrine indicators that show that, that certain sensation, like making sure that, you're checking your breathing, are they sort of like improved compared to people who are depressed and not feeling those, not practicing those sensations?
Yeah, like so I haven't done really a lot of stuff, in my lab for that, but I think what you would predict is like, the endocrine response or an immunological response, it's not all just like one thing continuous, right? You just keep like squirting more like, inflammation juice or like, vasoconstriction, juice into the system. And so what you don't see often is like a proper return to a baseline state. In someone who's chronically stressed, how do you even measure that baseline state? Right, so you'd expect that over time, if someone is really being able to engage in sensation meaningfully in a way that they haven't, that you're going to see physiologically what looks like a relaxation response. And I've seen this as like a mindfulness teacher, someone like who has their first relaxation response in like 10 years. And for them, it's like an epiphany because like they've been in it so long, they don't know what it actually feels like to be relaxed. And I think, and part of why psychedelics is so like galvanizing for people is it forces you to have an experience that's just outside of what you're used to the point where now you know it doesn't have to be this way. So first you see like relaxation response, in which you'll see like dilation of the blood vessels. You'll see increase in heart rate no longer predicts vasoconstriction. Like, so there's ways to measure it physiologically. And then over time, you shouldn't be squirting as much inflammation and vasoconstriction juice and all these, like interleukin-6 and all these inflammatory hormones. You should see that stuff go down, right? But I would say my reading of the literature is very mixed, right? Like and it's not always super predictable. And the flip side is stress itself is not bad, right? Chronic stress is bad. So the goal shouldn't be like, don't have any more stress hormone release. There's some awesome studies, I think, from the 80s or 90s where they looked at like people's surgical outcomes as a function of their cortisol levels before surgery. And for people who felt subjectively well prepared for what's supposed to happen after surgery, the higher their cortisol was, the better their outcomes were. But for people who felt unprepared and scared about what was going to happen after surgery, the higher their cortisol was, the worse their outcomes were. And so like, I think that's why like whenever, you see that same problem with heart rate variability, right? Like your heart rate variability should go down when you're concentrating on something important because you want to keep things like fixed. And also if it stays that way for a long time, you'll develop like a plaque in like one of your arteries. So like, I don't know if we're being nuanced enough with like the context in which we measure. But I would expect like if you had control over that context, you move someone into a sense foraging context, and they were really feeling connected to whatever they were sensing, and you were watching from before when they were stressed into that situation, you should see a lot of these markers start to go down. Yeah, and the time course for cleaning up a cortisol response, I think, is about 90 minutes. So you need to give enough time for that to happen. And that's the minimum for when your body like clears like one triggering event, right? So yeah, we need to set up studies that take more time, I think, also, and look for those contexts where you're going to see it. But one model we use that is quite low-hanging fruit for academics is how stressed people go leading up to midterms, and then how quickly they can get back to not feeling horrible after midterms. And many students now never get back to where they felt like at the start of the term. So that's a cool piece of variance that you think would tie into like all of this stuff in the body, I think, for sure.
So you talked about using sensation to bring you sort of into the moment, but what if that sensation is negative, like pain?
Yeah.
Does it still work the same way? Or
Yeah.
does that depend on if it's chronic or if it's an acute pain? Or
So, I mean, there's a whole other thing around like subjective effort and energy, and we know that so to answer your question, if you maintain sensory awareness of a pain signal, it would still help disrupt default mode processing if that's not what you normally do. And maintaining attention towards an aversive stimulus is very tiring. And you want to set people up for success. So you want there to be a bit of challenge so they're learning, but if it's a really intense pain, like as someone who started to develop, like played too many sports and then developed like early arthritis in my hip and used to be like a yoga, like I had really good yoga hips. And now I do like a yin class and it's like the worst part of my week was I'm just sitting in like butterfly and this one leg is like up here and it hurts. And in the first 5 minutes, it's like, I'm going to practice acceptance. But 15 minutes in, I'm like, I hate my hip and my stupid leg and my stupid body, and like, I'm never going to do this class again. And then maybe I work through it. And sometimes I don't. Like, I finish a class and I'm just angry. So like, my point is like, those times, like, it wasn't really that healthy for me to stay in the class. Like, the times when I was able to work with it and model sensation and find it in a way, but at a point where like, I like was just, all I was doing was resisting avoidance and there was no other ability to connect and it was purely negative, I might actually just be reinforcing avoidance in terms of like the snapback behavior when I tire out. So I think like going, and in mindfulness, we never want people to go to, like especially trauma-informed like traditions, you don't want to put someone in a place that's like ground zero for their conditioned association with their trauma. You want to find a place where sensation is not obvious, but also where it's not absent and it's not overwhelming. And you can teach people, there's ways you can describe that in the teaching, but you can crack open the door, you don't have to go through. You can also close the door. Like it's not always about just more sensation all the time. And people who go too far down that path, it's just one theoretical thing that's suspected to happen is that could lead into depersonalization or derealization disorder, where you kind of like focus so much on privileging sensation that you damage the ability to have a stable knowledge representation. And a little bit of flexibility and identity is good. Total flexibility is really bad. Like you lose your sense of purpose.
with like high doses of psychedelics potentially?
Yes, the hope there at least though is like by the time your liver and kidneys and stuff get rid of that stuff, like that stuff will come back online. But if enough people start doing high doses of psychedelics in the same way that most people who meditate have weird experiences and come back to earth, some people don't.
Yeah.
And psychedelics is like doing that all in a much shorter time. And unfortunately, that's going to be adjudicated in the courts because there's too much lobbying for psychedelics for no one can afford, capitalism can't afford to wait for psychedelics to hit the market. As someone doing psychedelics research, I have a very jaded view on it, but it's the exact same problem. Now you can't buffer yourself from sensation because you've done it from the bottom up, and in small doses that could be quite good. And in really large doses, it should snap back, but for some people it won't. In the same way that like your muscle stretches and it should contract again, and sometimes it just tears. Right? Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you for the presentation, so cool. So I do have a question. So the method that you listed that might be helpful to come back to depression after watching a sad movie are pretty much about acceptance and embrace the feeling instead of suppressing it. I was wondering if you were to watch something that has antagonistic effect of that sad movie, such as watching like a comedy afterwards, would it also help, or is it more like you're curing the symptom and not the root problem of depression?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's like you can use the same experience different ways. So if you're watching a movie as a sense forager, whether it's sad or happy, it would probably be okay. But if you're using it to distract and get away from the feeling, and it feels good, you're rewarding a pattern of avoidance. So you're feeding into it. And I don't think it's all just like mental effort how the suppression is happening. People have learned to find ways of letting their minds go elsewhere. And we know, again, if that happens in an extreme amount, they'll lose time, they'll dissociate. But most people aren't like completely dissociating, but they are still distracting and avoiding. And the flip side is if something is super intense and it does feel like it's harming you and you're too tired out to regulate it and there's no room for acceptance or reappraisal, like it's better to do distraction than nothing, right? So it's not like that would be a horrible thing, but it's not the best thing. Right? So you just kind of have to, that's the other thing about working with these experiences, you have to work from where you are. If you're super run down or you feel completely overwhelmed, that might not be the time to open up for more experience, right? But still sensory absorption without any sort of like elaboration could still let your body relax, which might be very good. But I almost feel like we should have two different brands of like these practices. Are you doing this for relaxation or are you doing this for like insight and growth and development? And it's fine to do either one, and it's kind of weird to confuse the two. So like, and right now I don't know if that distinction is really being made. And in that case, I'm not sure that just like watching your breath for distraction is that much different than like zoning out to TV. It should just help you get down back to baseline. And maybe even if you get down to baseline, you might get down to a place where now you can work with things because you're not so upset. And the emotion regulation literature shows us very clearly that people know and endorse that reappraisal is better than distraction, but when they're very upset, they will still choose distraction. So like I just think people as a whole, like people are kind of dumb sometimes, but like in general, we're doing what we think is best for us, and what they're communicating when they do that is it's too intense right now. So like you don't have to force it there, right? Yeah.
I was wondering if there's any information maybe you've come across about a lot of people as like a treatment protocol take antidepressants, and I was wondering if there's any research on the impact of antidepressants when it comes to trying to engage more in like your senses and separate yourself from
Yeah.
the sex state.
Yeah, like I think there's like a hidden like set of like hundreds of different ways people react to antidepressants underneath like the umbrella of like it makes you feel better. And there are a lot of people who will report both a type of like dominance over their thoughts, which is the serotonergic system kind of doing what will help you, but also like a numbness sometimes, and especially like sometimes you get anhedonia, which is like it's difficult to experience pleasure. People have problems with like sexual attraction, things like that from antidepressants. There's also a somewhat suppressed literature that shows that associative learning is worse on antidepressants because you're able to like, I don't know exactly why. Anyway, so there are definitely like side effects, and mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, for example, has been shown, like fairly convincingly now, to be a safer way of coming off of your antidepressants. And I think one way to think of, but that's not to say that the antidepressants weren't hugely helpful to roughly half the people who try them when they're in severe distress. So like, I kind of think of it as like a lot of, and you can make the exact same argument around things like transmagnetic stimulation. Like a lot of people who don't respond to antidepressants might respond to like some other therapy, but then they like almost everyone relapses within a year. And the same thing, if you go off your antidepressants, you tend to have a very high risk of relapse in the months following. So I think one way to think of it is like you can artificially, with side effects, stabilize your mood in a way, and that's a wonderful time to then learn skills that don't require that artificial stabilization. So I'm not really like anti or pro antidepressants. I don't know if you're fishing for that at all, but more that the idea that they have a really important role, and also it's crazy that someone would, when they're 20, gets put on antidepressants, and then there's no exit strategy. Because what will happen over decades, right, even if they're quite safe, is you will build up tolerance. It's impossible to take a drug all the time. Like, who when they were 15 thought like, I will never drink 3 coffees? Who's drunk 3 coffees at this point? So like you'll build up tolerance, then you need more of the drug to have the basic benefit effect, but what you don't habituate to is side effects. And so what we're leading people to is like kind of unexpected, sometimes horrific, like side effects from like 30, 40 years of antidepressant effects. And so the idea that you could develop compensatory strategies that involve things like attention, finding connection, finding meaning, once you've been stabilized by the drugs, I think that's like a mature way to look at, way to use them well. And there is really good evidence about, you can look for like antidepressant medication discontinuation studies, those are the kind of keywords to find researchers playing with that problem. Yeah, so Zindel Siegel, who I showed, ran some trials like that where you'd have people come off antidepressants but having done mindfulness-based cognitive therapy versus not, versus staying on their antidepressants. And the people who stay on their antidepressants look the same as the people who did mindfulness therapy, and the people who go off without some kind of like skills training, they relapse at much higher rates. Yeah. Yeah.
Is there any evolutionary advantage for the sensory reaction in the studies?
Is there an evolutionary disadvantage for shutting down sensation?
Or is there an advantage?
Well, I mean, to channel like Paul, who's just here, Professor Andrews, like you are going to be less vulnerable to taking in other information, right? If you get really, really stressed over your Twitter feed, the rest of the Twitter feed like will just slide by you. So I think there is an acute or temporally local emotion regulation benefit of tamping down sensation. Like it is bad, and I'd like to get away from that bad feeling. And then the ironic consequence of locking yourself in that mode is where you get into resistance mode and breakdown and things like that. So again, it's not wrong to distract yourself or try to turn around from sensation. Like someone's being annoying, and if you keep listening to them, like you're going to freak out. Like if you could stop listening to them, that would be quite useful. But then you would like to be able to start listening to things again in the future. And sort of because of these sort of micro aggressions, I guess, almost like to repurpose the term around social media, we keep getting that behavior cue to the point where like if it takes 90 minutes to recover from a stress response, how many times do you have a 90-minute break where nothing bothers you? Right? Like it's just, and if your answer is in an average day 0 times, then you're chronically stressed. So like, I think, so it's like, yeah, in the short term, for sure, like it can be quite useful. And if you have a serious problem to consider, like we follow the evolutionary perspective on depression, maybe even for longer than a little while, it'd be great to block things out so you can really focus. But at some point, like there's no juice in life that way, right? Like the things that make life worth living is not just the absence of being bothered. Though sometimes it feels like that's all you need, it's not enough. Yeah?
How can we tell the difference between how can we tell the difference between drug tolerance and relapse?
Like, is relapse because of drug tolerance?
Yeah.
Because there are different things. Like relapse is more like the clinical phenotype that the person starts saying that their symptoms are spiking, right? And drug tolerance would be more like the drug. I guess the drug isn't producing the same effect. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, you can up the dosage and see if it makes a difference, and if all of a sudden they start feeling better again, even though there might be other side effects, maybe you think that the reason they were relapsing was because of tolerance. But I don't know if there's really. It's a bit messy because also, as I said, people are getting better at becoming depressed with practice. But like if you have a situation where really nothing happened and someone became depressed again, then you start thinking maybe there's a biological cause, right? Yeah, that's maybe how I think about it. Yeah, yeah.
So we're not always aware of this like inhibition that we're doing.
Probably very rarely aware of it, or else you'd have a choice. Yeah.
Right. So, but what if we have like the normal inhibition, and so we want to like change that and take in more, but that puts us on like the extreme side because now we're taking like more sensation than we should. So like, is there any way to know how much much you're inhibiting the sensations there?
I think so. Like I use physical like exercise a lot for my understanding. So like imagine someone was like, you're really gonna work on this muscle. Like I'm gonna work on my tricep. I'm gonna do tricep training. And then you're asking like, well, how do I know when to use my bicep? It's like, well, after a while, you're gonna be like, oh, like why is my arm stuck out here? Right? And same thing, like I'm gonna really work on my biceps. And then at some point, you're gonna be like, I need to reach for something. So like, these are opposing kind of processes, right? And so I think of it the same way. You're feeling really overwhelmed and there's too much going on and you're feeling too much. Good time for distraction, relaxation practice, changing your environment, reducing sensation one way or another, right? You're feeling like empty, meaningless, disconnected, you're not sensing enough. So I think there's something that it's like that's bad on either side. But learning to distinguish between those two things would help promote behavior. And I don't think people really realize that these are two options at all. Right? Like, I don't know, often when I give these talks, people are like, what are you talking about? Like, you want me to meditate? I'm like, no, it's like bigger than that. And it's just like, so like, what's driving your suffering right now? Right? Is it everything's the same and it's always going to be the same and it's like hopeless? Like, go touch grass, right? And then, you know, everything's too crazy and chaotic. Like, go do something controllable, familiar, lean into the routine, let yourself relax. Yeah, that's the way I would do it. And I think it doesn't have to get more complicated than that at some point. Yeah.
One last question for anybody over here, Zoe?
I wondered if there would be any like gender or cultural effects. For example, you know, if you've been taught to be stoic
Yeah.
or to suppress emotions, how that would affect this research.
Yeah, I think there has to be. Even in the morning class, I asked like who in the room can feel their heartbeat, and like I think you put your hand up, and like maybe one other guy, and then like most of the women in the class, and I'm like, oh, so like maybe you already have to deal with more sensation than people who are identifying or at least presenting to me as male, right? And I don't know if that's like a reliable individual difference, but it points out that the fact that those differences can easily occur, and they could be because of gender lines, like sex lines, cultural lines. And yeah, there's the general thing of like, why do men tend to have more externalizing behaviors and women more internalizing behaviors, right? So what's their job, right? And so you could think of like your job as a man is like, you need to tamp this down so you can go do the things. And for a woman, it's like your job is to like, you know, cultivate like this kind of positive, like non-offensive, you know, like kind of like there's all these kind of stereotypes that tie into like, but so it's okay to have all these feelings, but you have to be careful you don't act irrational, right? Also, like in some ways, because so like there's just different ways people get typed, but I don't think it's as clear. Even in those examples, as I tried to improvise and somewhat failed to give a clear double dissociation, like in both those conditions, like both genders are being told to suppress a certain type of feeling and act in a certain different way. So I think it's more it's going to be more complicated than just like, well, men are always avoiding sensation and women are always avoiding like habit. Like I don't think it can be that simple, but in much more nuanced ways, for sure. Like in any given situation, you might have a different set of expectations for what's appropriate and what's inappropriate, and even things like, you know, stereotype threat literature points to that people might have different amounts of work to do in different situations. So like you're told this is a math test where men always do better than women, like you probably have more sensation to deal with. And they talk about that. I was talking about this idea of churn, like there's just amount of stuff that's getting stirred up. I've heard on some podcast is going to be different for each person as a function of all of these roles we have to play with. Whereas like the privilege, and one way to think about privilege is like you don't have stuff getting churned up. It's not that like someone, like there's also privilege, like here's a job or something, but part of the privilege is just like not having to deal with that stuff. And having to deal with all that stuff is going to lead people to feel overwhelmed and then avoid. So trying to understand like what are the nuanced conditions that are going to promote patterns of avoidance that become like calcified or entrenched, I think could be a really good area to look at, like cross-cultural research for sure, or gender studies and things like that. Yeah, it's a great question.
So I'll just remind everybody that there's a reception up in 205 that will start shortly. And with that, we thank Dr. Farb.
Thanks for coming. Appreciate it.